Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Thinking Inside the Box, the Gauntlet, the podcast of Operations Group at the National Training Center for Irwin, California. My name is Captain Seth Revetta, and I will be hosting this podcast today. The Gauntlet brings you best practices from the Army's experts in combined arms operations. Today, we will be sharing a podcast made by the Scorpion team, one of our combined arms battalion trainers, called Left of the Bang, a Scorpion Team Desert Dialogue. This mini-series highlights how to best prepare each warfighting function for some of the challenges of the National Training Center.
Good day, team. I'm Major Stephen Pyles. Welcome to our podcast. We're continuing with our series entitled Preparing for NTC, where we take a deep dive by warfighting function on the trends many OCTs are seeing, what the OCTs have coached, and recommendations for units to look for as they prepare for NTC. Today, for this episode, I have Captain Kenneth Russell from the Sidewinder team, an Intel officer trainer, as well as a micro trainer. I also have Capt Johnathan Eton from the Scorpion team on the Scorpion 9er. And also, we have a returner to our podcast, as you well know, Scorpion 30, Captain Seth Revetta, who will provide perspectives from our S6 enterprise and how it relates to the intelligence warfighting function. So, team, please introduce yourself and the number of rotations you performed here at NTC.
My name is Captain Kenneth Russell. I have 10 rotations as Scorpion 9er doing the Intel trainer for the Combined Arms Battalions here at NTC. Following that, I have 6 rotations as the MICO trainer, where I lead a group of HUMINT, SIGINT, GEOINT, UAS, and EW soldiers to focus on training the brigade's military intelligence company.
Hi, I'm Captain Johnathan Eton. I have 2 rotations here at NTC as the Task Force S2 OC.
My name is Captain Seth Revetta, Scorpion 30. I have done 15 rotations as the signal trainer for a Combined Arms Battalion, and I have also covered down on Scorpion 9er duties for 9 rotations.
And just to put things into context, we recently just wrapped up a great rotation where we've learned so many lessons learned that we want to definitely impart on the audience as they prepare for NTC. I know Scorpion 9er, you only had 2 rotations, but if you would like to go and enlighten us from the intelligence warfighting function and battle staff area, what have you seen as far as trends as the units that come with NTC from the warfighting perspective?
Yes, sir. So soldier and fighter management and delineation of duties and responsibilities is one of the biggest impacts I see to the intel warfighting function. They come into the box not prepared to run shifts, and they all just 24/7, and then you lose capability and capacity. In addition to that, a lack of battle rhythm, events being held to at the battalion level, and a lack of O&I updates leads to a degradation of shared understanding across the task force.
Captain Russell, I know you have a variety of perspectives, not only from the staff as well as MICO. What would you like to enlighten us on certain trends that you are seeing?
So the big 3 things that I see S2s really need to leverage the MICO better with are, 1, setting up their architecture, right? So you have to come in with the SIPR tokens necessary, with the accounts established. I joke about fact checking, right? You have to have all your equipment functional. You have to have accounts. They have to be able to communicate, which may require ComSec, and then you have to be able to transport to get it to whatever that end station is. So you have to have a fact-checked architecture, which is the foundation for your PACE plan. I'm sure we've talked about PACE plan, but that really allows the S2 to be kind of the single focal point where they are receiving information from the companies. They're receiving information from the scout platoon, from the UAS. All that's coming up to the S2. Looking up from the S2, they're tying into the, shout out to the MICO, right? You got the Brigade Intelligence Support Element, the BICE, as kind of the single clearinghouse within the brigade. But you don't have to tie directly to the BICE. You can go direct to various web platforms, various tools provided by members of the intelligence community. So showing up here with a functional architecture that allows you to communicate all the way down to all of your collection assets and to all your end customers, which again are those platoons out trying to win the fight, all the way up to the members of the IC, which may have a very wide aperture. People like NRO looking at overhead persistent infrared, allowing you to see explosions on the battlefield, points of origin, points of impact. They may be looking at a very wide swath of the battlefield. But you don't have to look at all that. You can set up your tools to only display the very narrow subset that you care about. Getting from your end users all the way up to the member of the IC and then back down and being able to kind of consolidate all of that as you're doing your TOC functions. It's foundational towards success at the NTC. The second thing is integration of collection teams. All right, so right off the bat, we always talk about CAPES briefs, right? Capability briefs. The language needs to shift on this. It needs to shift to employment briefs. Too many people are coming in here with a lot of experience from COIN, which is no longer applicable. I'll just highlight SIGINT teams as a real common example of a team that you might get if you get to come to NTC. SIGINT teams are not doing the STAG mission that you're used to, the SIGINT terminal guidance mission. That SIGINT team is no longer providing just collection on the field of either emitters or radios. Emitters, the way they're using current technology, are no longer easy to track since they've moved from 2G to 3G. Now that we're looking at military radios that are jumping 32,000 times a second, they're very difficult to fix with conventional SIGINT technology. So what you want to use those guys for is their access to the broader IC. Again, you're looking at a very large picture, but it's very easy to chop that picture down to the aimed areas of interest that you actually care about. Second thing within collection teams here, work with the MICO to make sure that you understand the collection focus of any asset that gets attached to you. You're going to be responsible for supporting their ability to collect. You're going to be responsible for making sure that their PIRs flow up in a lot of cases because you have an architecture within the battalion level that they may not be able to have or may need to execute, again, that PACE plan to get the message across to the vice. So it's very important that you have that relationship previously established. And it also helps to do some of the shadow reporting to the MICO commander, right? So like as the S2, you're going to be very concerned with these collection teams. They're under your charge, right? They're attached. They have whatever relationship they have. Help the MICO commander out. Help those soldiers out. Make sure that they're getting the food, the water, tied into the plan, making the hit times for their missions. They understand when your mission briefs are. Integrate them in. You do a little RSOI for any enabler that you receive. Give them a copy of your SOPs. And then finally, make sure, going back to that command relationship, do you have the ability to ITC that asset, the ISR tactical control of the asset? If they have their PIRs and you understand where they are and where they're collecting in time and space and task and purpose, can you give them additional tasks through that relationship so that you can maximize that asset being forward with you? Third thing is support to brigade. So we already talked about within the battalion, the importance of having an O&I brief, right? So make sure that you're sharing your understanding as the TAC is going out. Are you pushing forward an intel handover brief? Are you receiving that back from the TAC to make sure that whatever intel element is forward with the TAC and it has the sight picture of the ground fight is leveled with the image that the whatever intel element back at the TOC, at the main command post, has, right? So there's a little bit of an art to timing this where you want to find those lulls to just like, hey, I'm going to do a quick intel dump. The format that I like to use for briefs like this is the read. So what I recommend is, just periodically you go through this acronym in both of these locations. You're going to hit R, results of reconnaissance. So you're saying, hey, from my fighting position, whether that's at the main or forward with the TAC, here is what I am seeing. Here's the status of our PIRs. Here's what we're looking at, task and purpose, right? Then clearly delineate what you are looking with to what you are looking at. Here's where you start talking about the E, enemy action. Enemy action is your current battlefield intelligence. This is your current tactical picture. It is what your reporting is saying. From there, you move to the A, assessment. The first piece of assessment is BDA. What you're going to do there is you're going to go from here is what we are seeing to here is what I think about it. You're going from the what to the so what. You start with battle damage assessment. You say, hey, here's what I think we've killed, which again is an art form because you can't just take that, the reporting as the truth on that. You have to do some of the calibration of those reports to make sure that you're not over-reporting your BDA. So we say, hey, here's what we think we've removed from the battlefield. And then we move on to here's what I think is left and here's what I think is coming next. So we've kind of talked about the what in enemy action. We've talked about the so what in assessment. Now we got to get to the what's next. The D of read is decision. All right. If you're not ready to talk about a decision that either a friendly commander or an enemy commander is about to make, then I would argue that you're not ready to key the mic. So this is where you're starting to talk about things like, hey, the enemy commander is looking for a gap, a seam, an unlucky platoon. Right now, he has not committed his forces. He's still probing. This decision point is coming up in time and space. Or, sir, I think we've met PIR number 1. As soon as we have FFIR number 6, then we have reached decision point X, right? Because we are very deliberate in our planning and very careful with our decision support matrices. Moving back to, so I think that conversation needs to happen back and forth between the TAC and the MCP. It also needs to happen up to brigade. There's a lot of different formats within the battalion and the brigade level, but critically, they have to cross-coordinate. Doctrinally, what we do is we plan 2 levels down when we're fighting the enemy, right? The 2 level down at the battalion level provides a much more granular view that may adjust the brigade's understanding of the enemy COA. So it's very important that whatever you produce at the battalion level makes it up to brigade. Too often, that traffic is one way, right? Everybody's waiting for something to be pushed down from on high. On high is just another bunch of guys sitting up at a slightly better suite of collection assets and slightly more time with slightly more analytical power. Make sure that your call is making it up to brigade. So those are the three big trends that I really see S2s leaving assets on the table, leaving potential advantages on the table here at NTC. First up, just making sure they're locking in their architecture. Second, making sure they're properly integrating and employing their collection teams. And third, just having that detailed conversation across their echelon and up to the next echelon.
Perfect. We got a lot to unpack there. One thing I do want to introduce, we talk about the architecture piece. So Seth, from an S6 perspective on some of the architecture trends that what you've seen here.
So for the architecture, the S2 side of the house does own all of their equipment. And unfortunately, we see a significant trend where the 2 and the 6 do not talk at the brigade level until it's RSOI. And then they are both trying to figure out how to integrate the intelligence systems into the brigade S6's network, which does cause a lot of delays in the S2 being able to refine all of their products.
I think it's worth here delineating very clearly what you mean by the S2 owns all of their own architecture. Because the S2 has, the PMFWS, the Portable Multifunctional Workstation, part of the Distributed Common Ground System, Alpha Army DCGS program with capability to drop CD1. And I hope that's the end of the acronyms I'm about to spew out here. And they own their own Trojan, and here's another one, and the Tactical Ground Station, which do allow them to control a large chunk of their architecture. And one of the things when I'm coaching MICOs, I'm very deliberate about is talking to them about architecture. I hate that I've spent so much time with it. I knew IPB was interesting, but not the major thing when I came here. I just didn't realize that architecture and my S6 brothers were actually the all-stars out here. When you say that the S6 is not responsible for the S2 equipment, I think it's important here to note that a lot of the stuff that occurs here isn't using live SIPR, and that most intelligence PACE plans rely heavily on the Army Tactical Network ATN and various systems that the Brigade S6 does control and the Battalion S6s do control.
The intelligence warfighting function very often does rely on the JBCPs, the transverse, and all these other items. It's really all those alphabet soup that you just named out that we don't ever get to touch. So any additional intelligence collection assets that you bring to the fight, for whatever reason, the Brigade 6 tends to forget about those and not integrate them into their VALEC.
The most important thing to realize is that the architecture as well as integration of enablers. When units I have seen to come in NTC from the S3 perspective, you're talking about the intel piece driving the maneuver piece. You go into that talking about integration of those enablers to answer those PIRs that not only tell me how I'm trying to make my decisions as the Blue Force commander, how is the enemy, how are they about to achieve their decision on me, right? Because obviously you turn the chessboard around, we're trying to understand what the enemy is trying to do, what risks he or she is assuming, the timings, the triggers, and as well as what decisions that they're trying to make. We see a lot of commanders that they really don't understand the enemy's side. And that is where the intel piece needs to step up in order to help the Blue Force understand this is what the enemy is trying to do with the integration of enablers, with all of the great gadgetry that comes with it. I love the acronym you talk about the READ part there, but I know from an S3 perspective, you see a lot of heavily blue plan focused planning. It's almost like IPB becomes, okay, you did it, thank you, but this is what we're going to do anyway. So as far as we see here, we're going into reversing those trends. What you guys have coached members to help reverse those trends to help to get the enemy picture right so we can inform the blue plan.
From RSOI day one, typically I'll sit down with the S2, talk shift work, and talk timelines to get at that soldier management and the delineation of duties. But specifically talking about blue making decisions with the red picture in context, the S2 needs to step up and actually have a voice in wargaming and during MDMP. They can't just let another staff section say that's not going to happen, because the intel section is the one that has the best read on the enemy. They look up doctrine, they're looking at the red books, and we know based on doctrine how red will fight initially. And so that has to be, the basis of our blue actions. And we see a significant degradation in blue success when the intel warfighting function is ignored in wargaming and MDMP. But when that intel section steps up and actually gives a read and the movement maneuver plan is modified to account for that, we see much greater success. in those respects here.
John's absolutely right here. I think there's a two-part answer to your question, sir. So the first part is making sure that you understand the red plan, and that starts with IPB, but IPB is not an S2 function. IPB is a staff function. It's very important that there are numerous articles on reverse warfighting function IPB. It is important to leverage the fires expert to plan targets. It's important to leverage your S4 to think about how the enemy is going to do sustainment. It's important to talk to your S6 about where the mission command posts are and where the vulnerabilities in those mission command posts are. This does two things. One, it makes sure that you're not defaulting back to giving the maneuver guys a maneuver plan to fight against. You have to actually integrate warfighting functions for the enemy as the S2. You can't make it just as easy as like, right, this is where the tank is going to be. But second, it establishes a baseline across the staff so that every staff member has that deep familiarity with what the enemy capabilities are. They're familiar with the plan. They understand the plan because they help develop the enemy plan. So then the second part of this answer comes from collection management. So sir, you were talking about, hey, we have to talk about the red plan, but then we have to put our collection assets in the right time, space, task, and purpose in order to answer the questions, answer the PIRs that drive decisions. The first piece of that is making sure that you don't come up with your PIRs and your collection plan during IPB. Altogether, too often, the S2 goes, and that's the end of what the enemy is going to do, and here's where we're going to put our collection assets. The blue plan hasn't been developed yet. I think most S2s know that reconnaissance is an S3 function. The S3 is responsible for controlling the location of the reconnaissance assets, right? It's a platoon. The fact that it's a scout platoon doesn't suddenly make it the S2's responsibility. That's still an operation that needs to be synchronized at the battalion level. So it's very important. You come back during the war game. You test your collection management plan there. You figure out what questions you actually need answered to inform the right decision points. And then you publish your collection plan, your commander's reconnaissance guidance, your PIRs, your indicators, your specific intelligence requirements, information requirements at the op org to make sure that you actually have those assets, whatever collection assets you control. And it's a long list at a battalion. Don't get concerned here and think that it's just the Raven and the scout platoon. You have a long list of assets within the battalion, but you need to make sure that those are controlled the same way every other subordinate unit is controlled with your order. So hash that out in the war game and then publish it in the order.
Great discussions here today and so much to unpack. We're talking about integration of enablers. We're talking about internal team building functions, referencing roles and responsibilities within the S2 section. I would like to go ahead and ask our colleagues, what do you recommend that incoming units do in order to prepare to get after some of the things we talked about today?
Yes, sir. So we've hit on quite a few of these points, but the number one point is certifying Raven crews. So getting the Ravens out, getting multiple crews from every single company, not only the scout section, to certify crews on the Ravens, ensuring you have parts for those Ravens because you may or may not crash one or two while you're out here due to winds. So you need the part to rebuild those things. And then secondly, active SIPR tokens is a big thing. The battalion puts the STT up and we can get on SIPR, but some of those enterprise services for the intel warfighting function you cannot access without an active SIPR token. So making sure those are good to go. And then validating your send receive to brigade plan. So your PACE plan, not only are you going to receive reporting from higher, but also push, and simplifying that brigade S2 to battalion S2 PACE plan. I've seen some significantly complex PACE plans, and the more you can reduce those, the better comms you're going to have. And then validating your battalion equipment and architecture. We've already talked about, the battalion STT, and the battalion may have a GBS, might have an IFS stack, CD1 laptops, et cetera, but validating your individual units' equipment and not relying on the mission training center's pre-pod laptops that act on those networks, but your actual equipment at distance during your brigade CERTEXs or your field exercises, pulling out your equipment and talking. A subset of that is validating comms with your scouts. Typically, your scouts will have somebody that's a HF guru that at the very least can operate an HF radio. And when you're sending your scouts out, they're not going to have FM comms outside of a few kilometers. How are you getting those reports back? JBCP is something that's heavily relied upon, but validating your HF radio systems across the battalion, both your battalion S2, your S6, each line company, as well as your scouts, validating those before you get here. And then during RSOI, revalidating to make sure everything is still working, I think is a key piece, sir.
Okay, outstanding. Thank Thank you. Kenneth, anything to add?
I think John nailed the architecture discussion. I think something that gets lost here is the importance of having a pace plan for some of your processes. So as we're talking about having the systems in place to make sure you can get your IntSum out, understand that sometimes that's going to cause a degradation in the product itself. If you go from a JBCP overlay to an FM transmission, you can convey different informations, and having your shells pre-built for each of those different steps of your pace plan will save you a lot of flexecution at the end, right? It'll help you kind of systematize and really be able to adapt much faster. The other thing, if you are coming to NTC, do your IPB now. You are already at the point, you know the terrain, you know what the civil considerations are like, you know what the enemy order of battle is, and you probably have a pretty good idea of whether you're doing an east to west or west to east rotation. You have a good sense, and you probably have some people in your formation who have some experience at NTC about how the enemy is going to fight and what the battle periods are like. You should come to NTC with that entire staff very familiar with all of the enemy's capabilities, what the enemy order of battle is, what the urban clusters look like, what the terrain is like. As intel officers, we talk about 4 things, right? We talk about terrain, civil considerations, enemy, and weather. You know the answer to almost all of those before you arrive at the National Training Center. So do your IPB ahead of time. It goes beyond just a staff X, right? It is having everybody in that staff familiar with the baseline. So when you come here, all you're doing is just figuring out what the enemy course of action is for each battle period. And this goes all just as a simple TTP and as an example of this. Come out with your MCU done. Have it done on a layer of acetate. It'll pay dividends to have a analog copy as you're doing your plans. And then all you're going to do is each battle period, you're going to change your key terrain, your avenues of approach. There's no need to reanalyze all the terrain because you already have that familiarity built. And it's something that an S2 who's tech savvier than I am can do is get on one of those quiz apps and build an overlay with all the Hollywood names. They're Hollywood names for a reason. Going on 40 years of navigation around this desert, the places that we talk about frequently enough to have a Hollywood name are important. So get your IPB done before you come here. Have that baseline established so that all you're doing is making small adjustments. And then the next thing is practice your collection management with every opportunity. I alluded earlier to the fact that you actually have a ton of collection assets within a battalion. It is overly simplistic to look at the typical battalion and say, hey, you have a scout platoon and you have Ravens. If those are the 2 lines on your ICSM, you failed right off the bat. You're not thinking broad enough. So first of all, each company is capable of collecting. Each company may be able to answer a PIR. If you're in the defense, Alpha Company may be able to tell you whether the enemy main body is committed, and that's probably really important to you. So don't forget about your companies. Don't forget about your FSC. The FSC goes the full length and depth of the battlefield. You probably have some PIRs about urban terrain and about routes. Tag your FSC to answer them. Your scout platoon is not a monolith. Depending on whether you're running a 3x5 or a 6x36 construction, depending on the actual makeup of your scout platoon, you may be able to do a certain number of mounted or dismounted OPs. You need to be familiar with your formation sufficiently to know whether, hey, if I throw a Raven up from the scout platoon, am I costing myself a dismounted OP or a mounted OP? Go through that collection management piece. Make sure that you actually know your assets available. And then make sure you're giving them reasonable tasks. Okay, so it has to be a question somebody could answer. Don't have it be like, how is the enemy going to fight? How is the enemy going to defend Razish? Interesting question, not something somebody can answer easily. Are you looking for a scheme of maneuver? Are you looking for a slant? Are you looking for either mounted or dismounted? There's too many ways you can answer the question. Ask very specific questions. The closer you get to the cutting edge, the more specific your questions should be. An example of an excellent PIR is, has the enemy committed 6 tanks east to phase line, fill in the blank? That's a question somebody could answer. Your FFIR are generally very specific. Has the company started? Don't do the same, give the same credit to the enemy as you're thinking through your decision support matrix. And then finally, really spend your time refining your co-ops. John has already hit a bunch of this stuff, and I'm just going to underline it again here. Your battle rhythm needs to be understood at the battalion level. Your shift change format, your 2-minute drill, your 7-minute drill format needs to be understood at the battalion level. I'll offer again that the read works very well for all of those, and that will keep you practiced in a single method of conveying information, and it'll keep your audience used to knowing how you flow, which could prevent you a lot of interrupting questions that you're about to get to. But come in here with a very well-established battle rhythm and understand the process and the products that each one of those events is going to create. Have your talk board well-defined. John nailed it. Duties and responsibilities by shift, clearly defined within the S2 shop. And that is a conversation. There's no right answer to this because no two S2 shops have the same people. So it needs to be very personality-based, very specific to the problem set you have, to the solutions that you're going to be able to create. And then don't come to NTC and create new products. Come here with your shells already built. That can mean having your information collection overlay already built. You can have your InSum already built. Do as much as you can before you come here and you're in a time-constrained and a resource-constrained environment.
Seth, any recommendations for units coming in TC?
Yes, sir. The one thing that I think the intelligence warfighting function really needs to focus on prior to coming to the National Training Center is focus on a command post exercise to validate your technical and procedural systems in a field environment at distance. So perfect example, we had a unit that fought exclusively off of the Trilos, which is great because you have a lot more bandwidth than normal. However, when they actually had to start spacing out away from the brigade, their bandwidth pipe went substantially down, and the battalion staff got bottlenecked with how much throughput they could get out. So understanding the limitations of your systems is critical. Additionally, those procedural systems that I'm talking about, I think it's important for you to understand what the intelligence collection synchronization matrix looks like from brigade, how you receive that, how long it's going to take for you to receive that, and then you doing your bottom-up refinements so that you can actually have brigade potentially look at stuff for you if you are the priority of collection. Additionally, on that, if you are the priority of collection, how are you going to talk to the shadow platoon or whoever else is looking in that area so that you can potentially dynamically retask because you're the priority? Is it talking directly to the brigade too, or is it talking directly to that sensor? Those are questions that your brigade has to answer, but it's important for you to think about them. How are you going to send up your bottom-up refinement of the brigade common intelligence picture? Critical. Are you going to do it via JBCP in a chat room? Are you going to send up spot reports so that the entire brigade gets it all at the same time? If you do it in the JBCP, you can potentially flatten the communication immediately to those warfighters on the ground. Or you can have it in Transverse or ICI, whatever other chat systems you have so that the brigade too can receive that and then continue to refine their SIP. The last thing is understanding with the bandwidth constraints that you have, how can you leverage those national level assets? Which ones can you leverage and when? During the Brigade Bubber Cub is probably not the time for you to be accessing Fade Mist because you are going to make it so your battalion commander cannot talk. So understanding when is appropriate for you to be using these higher level assets.
I will be remiss if I do not mention OSRVT. It's linked to Ravens, right? But based on what you just said, Seth, specifically with the unit that we followed, over 90% of the time they had their OSRVT up and operational, and they were pulling brigade shadow feeds and answering PIRs. They were never the priority for collect, but it was incidental collection. As the shadow is flying to its destination, they're collecting information in their NAIs, as well as collecting on Gray Eagle. If they have the right fill, if they have the right downlink information, they can pull other people's feed to answer their PIRs. Making sure your OSRVT is right and working, and making sure you have the right antennas to receive from those echelons above brigade assets.
Due to time, gentlemen, I really have to put it into this masterclass, what we are seeing here today, representing Intel warfighting function. So I truly appreciate everybody's time today. Any resources that you would like to recommend for our listeners? What are the critical resources that you would like for our listeners to continue to look forward? I know a lot has been said today. Captain Eton, I will open up with you first.
Sir, I think all the intelligence professionals are holding our breath on the updated FM2-0, ATP 2-01.3 IPB. But just a little plug for two Intel courses, Information Collection Planners course at Fort Huachuca, and then Digital Intelligence System Master Gunner course at Fort Bragg are two significant classes that our Intel warfighters can go to. Even at the battalion level, DISMIG is predominantly focused at brigade and upper echelons, but going to DISMIG as a battalion too can help you to inform that battalion S6 up to the brigade, getting your Intel systems into the fight, sir.
Two other courses and one other plug, and then I'll hit just a laundry list of resources here. First is the Digital Intelligence Systems Foundation course. The second, which is the Gunner Entry Program. Both of those courses are generally available at each battalion and are very heavily focused on tactical intelligence and how to make your architecture work. Again, I've spent a lot more time talking about our architecture out here than I expected. These are the courses that gave me the vocabulary to do that. The other thing I'll foot stomp here is the importance of the military intelligence training strategy. Since its rollout, it has really helped standardize our training for individuals, crews, and platforms. You should come to NTC at least prepared with MITS Tier 4 through 2, if possible, and then use this as your culminating event, because this is one of the very few places where you're going to get a real environment and have a real OPFOR and have the architecture in place that you need. Now, my long list of references, I'm just going to fire these off rapidly, and I think we can include them in show notes. All right, so first off, ATP 2-19.4 Brigade Combat Team Intelligence Techniques. Foundational, the 2021 update is very useful. Second, if you happen to have a MICO or you're trying to figure out how to integrate a MICO, TC 2-19.01, the Military Intelligence Company and Platoon Reference Guide, has a lot of recommendations for how to train and equip and employ them. Third, ATP 2-33.4, Intelligence Analysis. It's a little bit more of a big picture view, but when you're sitting there training your all-source soldiers, your all-source NCOs, on how to actually go through some of these critical thinking techniques, and you want to get them to go past just what they're seeing, the what that we were talking about earlier, and get to that so what and the what's next. This is a very useful resource. ATP 2-01, Collection Management. Again, this is how we actually provide the information that drives operations. Give yourself the edge. Make sure you're leveraging your collection. Also, FM 3-98, Reconnaissance and Security Operations, January 2023 update has a lot of information on Commander's Reconnaissance Guidance. And I'll leave you with two more. One is the Soldier's Manual and Trainer's Guide for MOS 35 Fox Intelligence Analyst. That's STP 34-35 Fox 14-SM-TG. And then the final thing is you're coming to the National Training Center. We got a lot of desert and a lot of mountains out here. Crack open ATP 3-90.99 Desert Operations, April 2021. Not only does it talk about how you can manage your unit out here, but it also gives you some insight into how to do intelligence preparation in the battlefield, specific for the desert.
The one thing that I would like to plug is the Digital Master Gunner course, and that is just so the individuals sitting behind the computer understand how to effectively either utilize CPOF or CPCE, whichever one the brigade is using, so they can effectively submit reports or pull information from brigade.
As we close, I want to thank our three colleagues for taking the time today to discuss the trends and how to reverse those trends as units prepare for NTC under the intelligence and as well as S6 warfighting umbrella. Our intent is to spark dialogue with incoming units so that units can prepare for the upcoming rotations and get the best training possible.
As always, our observer coach trainers are here to assist units. I invite you to look at our Mill Suite page for the latest products from Operations Group and subscribe to Operations Group TAC Talks on YouTube for short lessons learned on successful techniques. Thank you for listening to Thinking Inside the Box, the Gauntlet, the podcast of Operations Group at the National Training Center.